going to do is just share my screen. We'll do that first. Get the slides up. And if you can keep me right to make sure.
Yeah, you're right. That's perfect, Damian.
Everybody can see that, okay? Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you very much again for the introductions. Yes, my name is Damian Mulholland, and I'm joined by my colleague today, Paddy-Ann. I'm going to take you through the first half of this webinar. Paddy-Ann will pick up the midway points of the field slides, and Paddy-Ann will take us through to the end where we'll have our short Q&A section as well. So we will. Claire stole on the thunder with regarding the housekeeping, so I don't think there's much more to say regarding cameras, mute, etc., etc. Just a couple of small things. The session normally lasts an hour and a quarter to an hour and a half, so we'll be aiming to finish up no later than 3:30. Tony has our evaluation or our link to our SurveyMonkey evaluation, and he will email that out to you. We also have a QR code. We're getting really high tech and fancy these days, so we have a QR code that takes you straight to the evaluation as well. And these sessions are still fairly new to us in the agency. We haven't been doing, online webinars that long. Traditionally, we did face-to-face seminars. So really important to us, to Paddy-Ann and myself, that you take just a couple of minutes to complete that evaluation and give us some feedback on what you thought. And if you feel we can do stuff better, differently, then please do feel free to say so, and we'll use that going forward. So really would appreciate that. We'll only take a couple of minutes of your time. So when we talk about dignity at work, really, for suppose for me, what I think of is the right of employees to be treated with respect, with consideration at work, irrespective of any differences we have. And it's about employers ensuring that all employees are provided with that safe and harmonious working environment, which is free, totally free from all forms of bullying and harassment. So this webinar, really, we're going to aim to raise your awareness of bullying and harassment in the workplace, or in some cases to refresh some of that knowledge and that experience that you have picked up previously. So I hope the session gives you a better opportunity to better understand some of the issues surrounding these topics, and to help you better recognize maybe and be aware of particular behaviors in the workplace. So basically what we're going to cover today, we're going to look at some examples quickly of bullying and harassment in work. We'll look at the differences between the two concepts, and we'll touch on those. The impact of bullying and harassment, both in terms of individuals and on organizations. We'll also take a very brief look at equality legislation and the avenues that are open to challenge bullying, and also understanding liability. And then, very end, we'll look at dealing with bullying and harassment. So the informal and the formal approach to it, and a little bit of good practice advice thrown in as well at the end there for you. So first things first, let's focus briefly just on what bullying and harassment are, so that you can recognize it in the workplace. It takes many forms. It's not necessarily just face-to-face. So we've broken it down into 4 areas for you. So in the workplace, it could be potentially verbal. So when we talk about verbal bullying and harassment, think for a second, what words or phrases would spring to mind you when it comes to that verbal bullying, verbal harassment? Just some examples that you can think of in your head. Some examples could be things like inappropriate banter. I'll touch on that again in a minute. Jokes, songs, name calling, sexist remarks, sexist comments, sectarian remarks, lewd comments, undermining comments, nitpicking, trivial criticisms, that sort of stuff, ridicule, humiliating or derogatory remarks, insults, shouting, swearing, being deliberately confrontational, maybe being deliberately argumentative with someone, whistling, innuendo, spreading malicious gossip or rumors. So that's just a few that I can think of. You'll probably be able to think of others, so that list certainly isn't exhaustive by any means. Then we'll look at written. So written bullying, written harassment, types of things there. Could you think about things potentially like emails, text messages, WhatsApp messages, graffiti possibly, social media postings, letters, notes, drawings, memos, even things like screensavers potentially, depending on what's on there. really anything you might see in the written format. Nowadays, we see insults, we see aggression showing up in writing too, with the use of emojis, block capitals, bold, underlining, question marks, exclamation marks, so things that are shouting, screaming out at us, from the page or from the screen as well. Then we've got physical bullying, physical harassment. What might that be? Some examples, again, could be inappropriate touching, patting, pinching, smacking, any sort of other type of physically offensive behavior that could include assault, finger pointing, hand gestures, inappropriate gestures, stuff like that. Facial expressions, pulling faces, unwelcome sexual advances, maybe standing too close to somebody in their personal space, in someone's face, just like that little picture I've just put on there, brushing up against someone. Aggressive body language, maybe using physical size to intimidate somebody, following, stalking, spying on someone, stuff like that. Again, you'd probably be able to think of others yourself there. And then the working environment. So what things might you see going on in the working environment that might constitute bullying or harassment? Think about issues such as isolating or excluding colleagues, deliberately refusing to cooperate with colleagues, or being deliberately obstructive. Flags, emblems, bunting, possibly clothing, maybe football shirts if they're allowed to be worn on occasions, badges, calendars, birthday cards, birthday jokes, suggestive pictures, posters, drawings, screensavers, even tattoos maybe. So lots of potentially different things there that could constitute bullying or harassment depending on the circumstances. Bullying harassment can take many forms. It can be hard to recognize. It can be obvious sometimes to others, but sometimes it can be very gradual. It can be very subtle. It can be underhand. Ultimately, whatever form it takes, it can be very harmful. And those on the receiving end might think it's normal behavior in the organization, especially if they're new. There might be that culture. They may be anxious that others maybe consider themselves not up to the job or a bit weak on it. If they find the actions of others intimidating, they might be accused of overreacting. There's often a fear. Think of retribution sometimes if they do make a complaint. So employers, line managers, trade union reps should be aware, should be looking out for individuals' behavior towards each other and proactively looking out for those warning signs as well. That applies to all colleagues, no matter what their role is. I mentioned banter a moment ago, and there's an old comment from a Fair Employment Tribunal way back in 1992 in the case of Grimes versus Unipork. It's still relevant to this day, even nearly 30 odd years later. Banter, however innocent, has the potential for mischief. What is banter for some may be intimidating or embarrassing for others. What is banter today may be dangerous tomorrow. There should be no place in the workforce for conduct that has the potential to disrupt the harmonious working environment or to intimidate or embarrass any worker because of his or her, and on that occasion it was religious beliefs or political opinion. The banter, we've heard of it. It happens in the workplace. It can be good for the workplace, because it can be open, honest. It can be delivered in the right way. But at the same time, it can have the opposite effect when it's delivered with the wrong intentions as well. Now, both bullying and harassment are perception-based, and that's what makes them, I think, so difficult to deal with. One person's idea of bullying or harassment can be another person's idea of a joke or fun. Behavior that's considered bullying or harassment by one person could be considered for management by another. And one of the reasons that there's not yet any legislation specifically designed to deal with bullying in employment circles is because it's very much a perception-based concept. Legislators have never managed to come up with a definition which describes bullying. Now, harassment too is perception-based. Legislators have come up with a definition of that. It appears to be working successfully in the courts. We'll have a look at that in a moment. Both bullying and harassment come with many of the same recurring features. And what I mean by that is there's a recurring pattern of language and types of behavior. So I'm going to show you a wee list in a second. Just have a think for a moment. What type of things do you think you come up with yourself? What types of recurring behavior, recurring language might constitute bullying or harassment? I'm going to touch on a few of them. I'm not going to cover them all. You can see there aggression. More often than not, it can be displayed, for example, in aggressive emails, aggressive language, aggressive tone, aggressive body language, rather than simply physical aggression. There's psychological as well. And in the workplace, bullying can often manifest itself as psychological behavior. So it could be intimidating, it could be undermining, it could be mind games at play. That can be much more difficult to pinpoint and therefore much more difficult to deal with, as it can be quite subtle. Abuse of power or abuse, well, power is mostly associated with seniority. Lots of people in organizations have power. Knowledge is power. And even someone at a more junior level in an organization can abuse their power. So let's say, for sake of argument, knowledge of technology or equipment like IT technology, photocopying, printing technology, CCTV. So somebody can use their knowledge that they have of that type of technology to make others feel silly or a bit useless if they struggle to use that equipment. And I've seen that myself firsthand in a previous role I had. And right around the very far right-hand side there, you'll see persistence. Now, persistence is a key element of bullying. For cases to succeed in law, then there has to be an element of repeated behavior. It's extremely unlikely that a one-off event will constitute bullying in the eyes of the law. Maybe that's not a bad thing, because we can all make a mistake and we can all learn from that mistake if we do or say something wrong. But if an incident is sufficiently serious, it need only happen once to be considered harassment. Now, you look at those two little twins on screen. So bullying and harassment's a bit like them. They look the same, but they are different. Behaviors and language can be the same. They can manifest themselves in different ways, like jokes, shouting, aggression, ignoring, exclusion, etc. But the motivation for the behaving in that way and the roots for challenging that behavior are different when it comes to the two concepts. So look at the motivation behind the behavior first. Harassment, well, that occurs if someone feels they're been treated differently because of some type of unlawful discrimination. And that would be based on protected characteristics. So things such as their age, their religious beliefs, their race, their sex, or a disability, for example. Bullying, well, that occurs if someone has been treated differently and they really just don't know why. So is it because of things such as personal dislike, revenge, jealousy? What is it? They just can't put their finger on why it's happening. So it's not as obvious to them. Legal avenues for challenging these things. Well, there is legislation in place to deal with harassment. There's no specific piece of legislation to deal with bullying in the workplace. However, that doesn't mean that a person doesn't have legal avenues of redress for bullying, as there are some, and some do exist there. And Paddy-Ann will look at those in the second half of the session. So let's look for a second at harassment and the legal definition first of all. So there it is. Harassment is defined as unwanted conduct which has the purpose or effect of violating an individual's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment. So that's the definition you'll find in the law. And the reason for that behavior or that conduct is because of the victims, the recipients' race, their sex or their gender, their religious beliefs, or similar philosophical beliefs, their political opinion, their disability, their sexual orientation, or their age. So look at it in a little bit more detail, just that definition. So it's unwanted conduct. So I think it's important for us all to remember that what's one person's banter or joke is another person's harassment. Purpose or effect. So it could be intentional, could be done on purpose, but it's not just what the intentions are of the person who's dishing out this behavior, but what the effect is on the individual who's on the receiving end, who's subjected to that behavior. So how the person on the receiving end feels about it. And then there's the offensive environment. So it's not necessarily behavior that's directed at you, but it could be happening in the office, in the corner of the office. It could offend you, it could violate your dignity, it could be humiliating, embarrassing, degrading, etc. So if you look at that definition and remove the second part of it, so the reference to race, to sex, to religion, etc., then you have a definition which could work equally well for bullying. At the end of the day, bullying is unwanted conduct, which has the purpose or effect, etc. It's embarrassing, it's degrading, it's humiliating, etc. So that's the definition that potentially employers could use to define bullying in their policy if they were developing one. For an incident of alleged harassment to proceed, let's say, to the industrial tribunal, then the incident must first of all fit within that definition. Industrial tribunals and fair employment tribunals will take into account a couple of very major points. So I'm going to read these out to you. So point one is how the conduct in question was perceived by the person alleging harassment. So remember, like I said, you could have someone who's very sensitive at one end of the scale, and you could have someone at the opposite end of the scale, at the opposite end of the extreme, who's very thick-skinned. Individuals will perceive behavior towards them in totally different ways. So for some, it won't bother them whatsoever, and for others, it will be totally unwelcome. And point two, whether the conduct in question should reasonably be considered as having violated the person's dignity or created that offensive environment. So the tribunal will also consider then whether a reasonable person would consider that the conduct towards them was discriminatory, had it violated their dignity, had it created that offensive environment. Now, in our experience, a lot of the time, perpetrators will say they didn't intend to cause offense. They didn't intend to violate the victim's dignity. They didn't intend to create that intimidating or offensive environment. However, the effect of the behavior will be deemed to have been harassment if having regard to all of those circumstances, in particular the victim's perception, that it should reasonably be considered as having had that effect. So really, in a nutshell, really important to remember that it's the effect of the behavior on the victim that's important. It's not the intentions of the harasser. Now, why should organizations and yourselves as trade union reps say, be concerned about bullying or harassment in the workplace? I'm going to put up a couple of little tables that cover maybe just some of the impacts potentially on organizations and individuals. Well, I think first of all, there's a clear link between increased bullying and rates of workplace stress and sickness absence. And certainly the CIPD have reported in both their 2020 and their 2021 reports, their health and well-being at work reports, that stress is still very much a major cause of both long-term and short-term sickness absence at work. And two of the most commonly blamed issues are relationships in the workplace and management style. So they're commonly blamed for stress at work. Now, many of us will know that stress can lead both then to physical and to mental illness, extreme feelings of frustration, anger, and unhappiness at work as well. That then has a knock-on effect on the workplace and the organization as a whole. You're looking then at things like low staff morale and healthy workplace culture, increased levels of absence, possible increased staff turnover as people decide it's an unhealthy, unhappy place to work and I'm out of here. There can also be a major knock-on effect then on costs due to covering absence, cost of absence itself, cost of recruitment, cost of training new staff. And then you've got losses of productivity, possible expensive court cases as well. There's been a few cases recently there that have hit the BBC News where the Equality Commission were involved. as well, where there was hefty sums paid out. And all that is before the effect then on, let's say, our customers, our clients, etc., the people who we're dealing with, let's say, across our public counters or across the phones and stuff like that as well. Organizations can also suffer badly damaged reputations due to very negative publicity also. That recent case there recently of the lady who returned from sick absence after cancer treatment, and her employer was Yellow Door Catering. So potentially Yellow Door could have suffered quite badly there from the negative publicity that got from that. So it's in all our best interests, doesn't matter what your role is, but especially as employers, as trade union reps, as line managers, to promote a safe, a healthy, a fair environment in which people can thrive at work and be happy at work. Just one example, it's a case that you can look at yourself. I'm not going to go into it in any detail. If you want to Google Green versus Deutsche Bank, it's a 2006 case. One of the really extreme cases of bullying and how it impacted on a person. And that lady, Mrs. Green, ended up receiving £850,000 in compensation. Things were that bad. So it's well worth having a wee look at that when you get the chance. Green versus Deutsche Bank. Now, I mentioned earlier that anti-discrimination laws give us protection to those people who are subjected to harassment. So harassment is a form of discrimination. We're going to have a quick look just at the grounds that are protected under equality legislation, just so you're familiar with them all. So the Sex Discrimination Northern Ireland Order of 1976, well, that covers sex, pregnancy, maternity. It also covers gender reassignment, and it covers marital status and civil partnership status. So that piece of legislation, umbrella legislation, covers all of that. Then we've got the Disability Discrimination Act of 1995. And that provides protection on the grounds of disability, which is defined in that piece of legislation. And it also covers the employer's responsibility to make reasonable adjustments. In 2003, then we had the Employment Equality Sexual Orientation Regulations, Northern Ireland. That covers all sexual preferences. We've got the Race Relations Northern Ireland Order of 1997. That covers race, colour, nationality, ethnic or national origins. And interestingly, Irish travellers are deemed to be a racial group for the purposes of that particular piece of legislation as well. Many of us will be familiar with the Fair Employment and Treatment Northern Ireland Order 1998. So that covers religious belief, so Catholic, Protestant, excuse me, any other religious beliefs or absence of religion too. The legislation also provides protection for any lawful political opinion. And it also covers similar philosophical belief. Again, some of you may have seen over the last couple of years, some philosophical belief cases going through the tribunals in England, especially. So similar philosophical belief is something that you strongly and genuinely believe in, concerns an important aspect of human life and behaviour. And the courts have said over the last few years that things such as climate change, pacifism, humanism, atheism, and ethical veganism are all philosophical beliefs. More recently, vegetarianism, there was a case taken about vegetarianism, and the courts ruled that it did not meet the necessary criteria to be regarded as a philosophical belief. And then finally, we've got the most recent piece of legislation, 2006, and that was the Employment Equality Age Regulations. That prohibits discrimination across all ages and age groups as well. Worth noting just that we have 6 individual pieces of legislation there. We're different from GB, so across the water, all those pieces of legislation that they had, all very similar, were all brought into one act under one umbrella act called the Equality Act of 2010, and that covers all of those areas across the water. We do have a little document on our website detailing the differences in NI and GB legislation if anybody wants to have a look at that. I'll touch on liability just for a moment. Employees, well, they can be held liable for acts of harassment against others, personally liable. Okay, this means that a claimant could take a tribunal case naming both an employer and an individual employee, a colleague, on the claim form. And it's definitely not uncommon anymore to see this at the tribunals. Frequently, we would see individuals pay compensation out of their own pockets to their victims. I'll just give you one quick example. The case of McGee versus Edmondson Electrical from 2015. That was a case against the Korean electrical company. It was made by a young 23-year-old woman who was a young mother. She applied for a job and was successful. And when she went in to see her new boss a few days before she started work for them, she was told she would have to work much harder to compensate for her looks, for the fact she was a woman, by a male manager just a few days, I say, before starting work. She reported that exchange to the recruitment company who were handling the recruitment process, and the job offer was withdrawn. She was told by the now former manager that she would struggle in the company because she was a young woman. Women of childbearing age were a hassle, and that among others don't make managers. She wanted to speak to the Equality Commission, who supported her, and that resulted in a settlement of £17,500 from the company itself and £2,500 out of the manager's own pocket. So the man who made those comments had to fork out £2,500. You know, that's a case in the public domain as well, and the Equality Commission have published that on their website too. And then we have organisational liability. So anti-discrimination legislation can hold an employer vicariously liable for discrimination by their employees, where those acts are carried out in the course of employment. Now, case law would indicate that tribunals give a very broad interpretation of what constitutes in the course of employment. So, for example, an employee could be sitting at home in their own time, using their own computer, say, and post a derogatory comment or a picture or a video on a social networking site about that could amount to harassment, and the employer could be held liable for those actions if they're found to be made in connection with their employment or in the course of employment. I'm sure all of us can think of other, especially social situations outside of the workplace, but still potentially in the course of employment where there is potential for harassment. Things like staff nights out, Christmas dinners, Christmas parties, that sort of thing. Now, before I hand over to Paddy-Ann, I just want to go through one final slide, and that's reasonable steps defence. So that's where an employer could potentially not be held liable for the actions of its employee or employees if they can demonstrate that they took all reasonable steps to prevent those actions occurring. So the actions that potentially amounted to harassment, if they took all reasonable steps to prevent those from occurring. So it's important for an employer to not only have a policy and procedures in place, so that's the first step, but ensure that that policy and those procedures actually live in the workplace. So they're not paid lip service to. It's not a paper document that's left to gather dust on the shelf, or it's not an electronic document that's left on a computer drive somewhere. It's a living document that actually lives and breathes in the workplace. So employers should consider things such as training everyone on that policy, including examples of inappropriate behaviour. Look at providing separate training on things like equal opportunities and equality itself. Think about drawing employees' attention regularly to aspects of their policy. So little snippets that they would send out now and again, just on little parts of the policy as refreshers. Remind staff prior, say, to social events of an organisational policy and the protocols around work-related events and the behaviours that would be expected. Particularly keep records of how they have dealt informally or formally with inappropriate behaviour, with banter, with workplace grievances, bullying and harassment grievances in particular. And I think it's really important too that they conduct a refresher training session on bullying, harassment, dignity at work, whatever we want to call it, annually. That keeps it fresh, keeps it in people's minds and keeps it uppermost in their minds and just isn't allowed to be forgotten about. And keep records as well of employees who participated in those training sessions as well. So they're actually physical records of who's taken part, and ideally signed documents to say, yeah, I took part in that. You probably think of others yourself. Those are just a few examples of the sort of things, the sort of actions that might help an employer to avoid liability. That's my half of the session over. I'm going to hand over to Paddy-Ann then, who'll take us through to the end, and then we'll, after that, we'll have our Q&A discussion. What I'll do is, Paddy-Ann, I'm just going to stop sharing, and that will allow you to share your screen then.
Okay, that's great, Damian. Thank you. Share screen. Now, you see that okay?
No.
No.
No, can't see anything at the minute.
Why is that now? Because I can see it. See it now?
That's us, Paddy-Ann, yep.
Don't know what happened there. Weird. Anyway, sorry about that, folks. Okay, so thanks for your half, Damian. Very comprehensive. So far we have explored the features and the definitions and liabilities involved in bullying and harassment. And we've also examined the legal avenues of harassment. So now we're going to have a look at challenging bullying and policy considerations as well. So as Damian has already told you, there is no specific legislation for bullying itself, but that doesn't mean that employees have no way of challenging bullying or that they've no rights in that respect. It just means that you have to find an alternative route. In other words, another hook to hang your hat on, so to speak. There's also no victimization protection because there's no statutory legislation around it. And also bullying can be very difficult and expensive to pursue through the courts. So sadly, what tends to happen is that people feel that there's no option only to give up their job. The law doesn't really solve the issue of bullying. All it does is provide some compensation for people who leave their job. And even that is a fairly drastic step if you think about it. You know, if your behavior was such that it amounted to somebody giving up their job, you know, would you really want to have that on your plate? So as I say, this slide makes it sound like it's impossible to challenge it, but we're going to have a look now at some of the other routes that have been used successfully to challenge bullying in the workplace. So here are some cases. I'm not going to go through all of them because we'd be here all day. There are quite a lot of them, but they are in your PDF handout, so you can look them up. I'm just going to mention some notable points. And as Damian's already mentioned, this is a small country and the cases that we mentioned tend to be local to make it more interesting for you. So if any of you are related or know people involved, there's no offence intended. Obviously, they're a matter of public record anyway, because they are on the tribunal website. And a lot of them are also reported in the press. So in terms of unfair dismissal or constructive dismissal, constructive dismissal, by the way, for anybody who maybe isn't familiar with it, it's a form of unfair dismissal. It's basically where, because of the actions of the employer or the behavior that you're receiving at work, you feel you've no option only to resign, give up your job because you just literally can't stick it any longer. So if an employee is dismissed for raising a bullying complaint or because of long-term sickness due to being bullied, they could pursue an unfair dismissal complaint, okay? And for constructive dismissal, the employee has to show that there was a fundamental breach. In other words, something that goes right to the heart of the contract. So for example, the breach of the implied term of trust and confidence, or the employee believes that maybe the employer's action or inaction in dealing with it has seriously damaged the working relationship. So for example, there on the top of the screen, you can see two cases. The second one's probably a more familiar one for you. That was the case of Taylor versus Crawford's Burn-In. That was a breach of trust case, an constructive dismissal based on a breach of trust. In that case, Mr. Taylor was the head chef in the Crawford's Burn-In, and he was repeatedly sworn at, shouted at in front of other staff. There were a lot of meetings taking place in a very cramped office where there was little personal space and a lot of finger pointing up close to his face. He eventually decided he couldn't cope any longer and he went off sick. He never returned to work and he pursued this constructive dismissal claim and was successful and eventually was awarded £22,000. In both those situations of constructive dismissal and also unfair dismissal, the employee needs to have 1 year's service. Okay. Another avenue there is breach of contract. Now this is different to the one we've just mentioned, which is the tribunal claim. Breach of contract can also be taken as a civil claim where compensation isn't capped, because as you'll all know, there is a cap on your awards in the industrial tribunals. But this case on your screen here now of Herculac versus Cantor Fitzgerald was a case, a very high profile case where the senior managing director took a claim against the president of the company. So those are high earners. And that's why that would have gone to a civil court, because of the potential for bigger damages. And in that case, that was a breach of contract based on the employer supposedly having to render reasonable support to an employee to allow them to carry out their role without harassment from colleagues. And the president of the company was a very dictatorial character who regularly ridiculed the senior managing director and picked holes in his work, etc. He successfully pursued his claim and was awarded just short of £1 million plus costs. You can understand why that was worth his while making that a civil claim. The other time a civil claim might be suitable as well is for someone who has less than a year's service and therefore they're not eligible to pursue an industrial tribunal claim. Health and safety, duty of care, personal injury, that's another kind of umbrella for claims to go through for bullying as well. So employers, as you would know, are obliged to provide for employees' health and safety, including providing a safe working environment and a safe system of work. And it covers their welfare, which includes protection from psychological injury. So if an employee felt that the employer wasn't fulfilling their obligations under health and safety legislation as a result of bullying, then they could make a complaint to the health and safety executive or the local appropriate authority. And personal injury claims, the employers also have a duty of care to the employees. And if an employee has suffered a psychological injury as a result of bullying and hence negligence by the employer, then under health and safety duty of care legislation, the individual could pursue a personal injury claim in the civil courts. Obviously, you would need to have legal assistance for that, though, so it is going to involve costs. And a number of stress claims have been pursued in that way. And that case that's on your screen now, Walker versus Northumberland County Council, is one such case which arose from work-related stress from a heavy workload, but it could equally be used for stress arising from bullying as well. Another avenue or another hook for you is public interest disclosure, or whistleblowing as it's better known. So an employee who's made a public interest disclosure about bullying where they show that this is a breach of law, so for example, a health and safety issue, they have protection from suffering any detriment as a result of making such a disclosure. Or if you're bullied because you've made a protected disclosure, again, you would have protection there. And that case on the screen now, Cumbria versus Cumbria County Council was one such case, which was a woman working in a care setting, and she complained about the treatment of some of the patients and successfully won her case because she was bullied in work because she made the complaint. And then the last area we're going to discuss there is protection from harassment. Now this is different to the harassment that Damian was talking to you about earlier, which is based in the equality legislation. This protection from harassment is the Protection from Harassment Order Northern Ireland 1997, and it's anti-stalking legislation, which has quite a lengthy description, so bear with me, I'm going to read it for you. The description of it is: if a person pursues a course of conduct which occurs on at least 2 occasions, which includes alarming another person, causing them distress, or putting a person in fear of violence, and which is objectively judged to be oppressive and unreasonable to the extent that it would attract criminal liability, then theoretically the recipient of that behaviour could have a legal avenue of redress. So you can see there on your screen a number of cases that have been successfully challenged. Well, a couple successfully, a couple not successfully challenged using that legislation. But as you can see from the definition, there's a fairly high bar there, because for something to attract criminal liability, that is a pretty high bar. So, having looked at those cases now, we're going to have a look at dealing practically with bullying and harassment in the workplace. And the starting point for it, obviously, is to have a policy and to look at policy development. So it's very important that you have a visible procedure for dealing with bullying and harassment in the workplace. And that provides a framework or a guidance for employees who feel that they are maybe suffering at the hands of someone who's bullying them or harassing them. And it also provides guidance for the manager when someone approaches them, and they know the steps that they should take to support that person. Overall, responsibility does rest with the employer to provide a good and harmonious work environment where all staff feel that they are treated with dignity and respect, and where no worker is subjected to bullying or harassment. However, all staff have a responsibility to promote and to adhere to the policy to ensure a workplace free from bullying and harassment. Remember, many of you are in the unique position of being maybe an employee, a trade union rep, and very possibly also a line manager. So you're wearing a lot of hats, and it's very important that you keep an open mind on how you deal with these potential problems. Not least of all because, as Damian said to you in the first half, bullying in particular can be psychological. It's sort of mind games, and it can be very difficult to recognize. So sometimes you may find yourself getting a complaint or somebody coming to you with an issue that you really didn't expect to come from where they're saying it came from. So just keep an open mind about it. Employers can certainly help by setting standards of behaviour and giving examples of what's considered to be unacceptable behaviour. And the policy could include things such as a statement of commitment from senior management, making it clear that bullying and harassment is unlawful and will not be tolerated. And when you get that commitment from the top and it's visibly put into practice, that helps to get buy-in, okay? So say bullying will be treated as disciplinary offence. These are the things that should be in your policy. Steps that the organisation will take to prevent bullying and harassment. Details on confidentiality, because that's so important for people to have any faith in the process. They have to be sure about confidentiality. How to raise complaints and what are the timescales for the complaints? What are the responsibilities of managers and supervisors? There should be documented training for the entire organisation, and there should be training for new recruits as part of the induction process. Remember, a complaint of bullying, excuse me, ultimately is a grievance, and so it should comply with the LRA Code of Practice on handling discipline and grievance procedures, and it should promote informal resolution where appropriate. Now, it's not always appropriate. Obviously, it will depend on the situation, and sometimes that's just one of the things that you'll have to be able to work out for yourself if you're a manager. That goes with the territory. And if you're not sure, you can always speak to HR to get some help with it as well. So training managers to proactively deal with issues informally should mean that a lot less formal complaints are received, and that's much better for employment relations. So it's important that managers are trained in the policy. The procedure for the manager should be the first point of reference when someone comes to you with a complaint. You are responsible for the promotion of the managers are responsible for the promotion of the policy and for putting it into visible practice, ensuring compliance, and sometimes that can mean taking corrective action. So take a proactive approach to bullying and harassment. Look out for warning signs rather than waiting for something to land on your desk, because when things are nipped in the bud early, it's much easier to resolve them. You need to be alert to what's going on around you. Watch out for inappropriate behaviour and don't be afraid to challenge it. Look out for things like increased levels of absence or increased levels of absence in a particular work area, or high levels of general absence, changes in behaviour, Those kind of things can be indicative in particular of bullying, because as I say, it can be harder to spot. And be sure to intervene when you see that inappropriate behaviour. And that sends out a very clear message that it won't be tolerated. I think sometimes we're afraid to do that because we feel, oh, well, you know, if I leap in and start challenging people for what I think is inappropriate behaviour, then I'm going to be accused of being a bully. But, you know, you can deal with things by drawing a line in the sand, particularly if you've got buy-in from above in the organisation. You know, it's fine for the organisation to make a statement and say, you know, we realise we've let things maybe slide a bit. So as of a given date, we are actually going to use this policy and deal proactively with bullying. So that's your protection then for you to be able to feel confident about going ahead and dealing with it. Also remember, if you are in a management position, to maintain a professional distance. It's fine to be friendly with your team, your staff, but you do also have to be able to maintain a professional distance so that you can manage them and be able to nip things in the bud. Employees should be supportive of others as well, and try to imagine how they would like to be supported in a similar situation. Aim to be more self-aware, because sometimes we don't realise just how we come across, and maybe, you know, our behaviour does give cause for concern and we're not aware of it. So hold the mirror up to yourself and think, what is it like to be on the receiving end of me? And then, as with any policy, review it. Is it fit for purpose? And make sure that you follow it, because if you don't, let's face it, as Damian has told you, you can be held vicariously liable for your actions. And the employer can also be held vicariously liable. So it's not going to help your CV any if your behaviour lands yourself and your employer in court, where you're both being sued for your behaviour. So, dealing with complaints informally. The informal route, as I said, should always be encouraged, and Damian has also stressed that as well, because problems can be better dealt with at this early stage, and it's quicker, and it's also easier to protect confidentiality. But also it's only suitable for informal for minor matters, or where behaviours haven't become too entrenched. And at that stage, really all the employee generally wants is for the behaviour to stop and normal relations to be restored. So there's several options open for dealing with it informally. You see them here on the screen. So if the employee feels confident enough, they might be happy to approach the person who's causing the problem, approach them directly, making it clear that their behaviour is inappropriate, or that it's making them feel uncomfortable and that they want it to stop. Now that is pretty ideal, because for a lot of people, particularly where it's power abuse, it's very difficult to approach somebody who's maybe senior to you, or who's made you feel uncomfortable in the past because you're not sure how they might react, etc. They might have the option of approaching them with the support of a manager, a designated advisor, or perhaps yourselves as trade union representatives could support this person or go on their behalf and explain that the behaviour is inappropriate, or that it's making the person feel uncomfortable. Because the person who's the subject, or is the alleged perpetrator, may not be aware that their behaviour is causing a problem, and a simple word in their ear might very well resolve the matter. And if it does, that's fine. Just monitor it, keep a note, and make sure that, you know, matters remain resolved. If that doesn't resolve the matter, or that approach isn't appropriate, then obviously you would have to use a formal action. But it's like quite often with bullying in particular, when the person realises that they've been called out, that's enough to make the behaviour stop. But if it doesn't work, as I say, we're going to have to move on then to the formal stage, and we'll have a look now at the steps involved in dealing with complaints formally. So as you can see there on your screen, that's an overview of the process. Something happens and something kicks off, and we do your investigation, meet with the complainant. You always meet with the complainant first, okay? Meet with the harasser, meet with your witnesses, etc. So it's basically the same stages as you'll go through for any potential formal action, okay? And it's very important that you follow those stages, so there's a clear pattern to how you dealt with it, because as you would understand, those complaints can end up at tribunal, and the tribunal will want to see how the complaint was dealt with formally in the workplace. Okay. So moving on now to good practice advice. Think of what a mystery shopper would think of your workplace and your personal behaviour if they looked in, like a fly on the wall. Would they think that you treat each other properly? Would they think that the conversations you have are appropriate? That, you know, if you're discussing a TV program or something political or whatever, would they think that that's appropriate? So remember also, treat each complaint seriously and judge it on its own merit. Don't ignore problems or treat them flippantly, because you can be sure that the very one that you don't take seriously or that you treat flippantly will turn out to be a very serious one. And as I say, Damian's explained to you about the potential for liability within the workplace. And do remember that some people are a lot more sensitive than others. So while something might not offend me, it might very well offend my colleague. And the best way to keep yourself right is to follow the guidelines in your workplace about what is considered appropriate and inappropriate behaviour. Make sure if you're a manager that you know, or as you see yourselves as trade union reps, so you know what's going on within your team, and make sure as trade union members that you promote that culture within your membership as well, because sometimes it can be difficult. Maybe people get a wee bit carried away with their behaviour and whatever, and it's good sometimes to just bring them back to base and remind them of the general principles of what is reasonable behaviour in the workplace. And as I said earlier, make sure you know what's going on with your staff. Treat everyone fairly and consistently, because otherwise you run the risk of, oh yes, you did this for so and so and you didn't do it for me, and we all know where that ends up, because you end up then with complaints about favoritism, which potentially leads to discrimination complaints, etc. Because people aren't happy, they generally look for a reason for their unhappiness. So, you know, it's because I'm male and you're female or whatever. So be very careful about consistency. And remember, use your policies and procedures. That's what they're there for. Follow them, because it will help to show that you treat everyone the same, and also that you're consistent. Because, as I said earlier, you can get yourself into very deep water by not using your policies, and they are there for your protection. So moving on now to COVID considerations. The COVID pandemic hugely changed many ways of working for many of us, firstly with remote working and now increasingly with hybrid working. So just be aware that people are still struggling. People are still trying to come to terms with this whole having to work remotely, even for ourselves and delivering these sessions. I mean, it's just not the same as doing things face to face, and some people cope better than others. Therefore, you may find people acting out of character, behaviours because they're stressed. You need maybe what they aren't normally. So as managers, you need to ensure that you're aware of the potential for bullying and harassment, or for allegations of it, because people they're working out of their comfort zone to a large degree. You need to communicate expectations for staff about when they need to be available and how their work's going to be monitored and how their performance is going to be monitored and all that kind of thing. Because those kind of situations are the ones that will give rise to stress in the workplace. So develop a remote working guidance. That is key to helping people so that they understand what's expected of them, what the rules are. Be aware of what's going on in your team, what's going on in the workplace. Understand that people are suffering from stress and anxiety, and it's very important that you're mindful of all that. Communicate and stay connected with your team. Stay connected with the people you work with, particularly people that you know are struggling. It's also incumbent on the organisation to make sure that people who are working from home have the right technology, the right training and resources to be able to work from home, because that also leads to frustration, and we all know frustration leads to stress, and there you have a breeding ground for bullying and harassment, even just in terms of how people communicate with each other. So, sources of help, folks, just to wrap this up before we go to the Q&A. You can see there we have our Workplace Information Service, which is staffed by a team who are more than happy to discuss issues with you. They won't give you a legal opinion, obviously, because we're not legally qualified, but they're more than happy to listen to your complaints, issues, and signpost you to other sources of help. You see there our website as well, where there's information available, also the Equality Commission, and also finally, oh, sorry, folks, I just took that off you. Bullying, www.bullying.co.uk is also very useful, and ACAS as well, although they are mainly aimed at GB. But again, they can provide sources of help. Should have also said to you when I was talking about the issues with the remote hybrid working, there's also good guidance on our website now on that topic, and particularly the hybrid working, where we have now guidance, including a sample policy for you that you might find useful. So that wraps up the actual presentation itself. I'm now going to move on to the Q&A session with Damian, so I'll stop sharing.